The snow crunched beneath Oberleutnant Klaus Hartmann's boots as he pressed the field telephone closer to his frozen ear. It was the morning of January 3rd, 1945, somewhere in the thick forests northeast of Bastogne, Belgium. Through the observation slit of his forward bunker, Hartmann could see the American positions across the valley, a thin line of foxholes and hastily dug entrenchments, perhaps 800 meters distant. Behind him, hidden among the trees, waited 3 companies of grenadiers from the 212th Volksgrenadier Division, cold and exhausted men who had been fighting since the 16th of December. "Artillery observer to fire control." Hartmann spoke into the handset, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "Enemy infantry concentration, grid reference 742, distance 800 meters, requesting fire mission." The response crackled back almost immediately. "Acknowledged. Stand by for ranging shot." Hartmann had served as an artillery observer since 1942, first in Russia, then briefly in Italy, and now here in the Ardennes during what the propaganda ministry was calling the Great Winter Offensive. He had called in hundreds of fire missions during those years, directing the shells of German 105mm light field howitzers, the LEFH-18, onto Soviet positions, British strong points, American advance units. He knew his trade. He understood the mathematics of indirect fire, the careful orchestration of ranging shots followed by fire for effect, the precious minutes required to adjust and correct. But something was about to happen that would shatter everything Klaus Hartmann thought he understood about artillery warfare. The German ranging shot came perhaps 90 seconds after his request, a single shell that burst 50 meters short of the American foxholes, throwing up a fountain of frozen earth and snow. Hartmann adjusted his calculations, called in the correction, and waited for the fire for effect order that would bring a full battery of 4 guns to bear on the target. That was when he heard it. A sound unlike anything in his experience. Not the whistle of incoming shells arriving one by one. Not even the terrifying shriek of the Soviet Katyusha rocket batteries he had endured on the Eastern Front. This was something else entirely. A sound that began as a low rumble and rapidly built into a roar, as if the sky itself were tearing apart. Hartmann looked up instinctively, though he knew better. A soldier never looks up when he hears incoming fire, but some primal part of his brain overrode his training, because this sound was wrong, fundamentally wrong. Artillery shells were supposed to arrive sequentially, one after another, even in a barrage. First one gun fired, then seconds later the next, each crew working as fast as they could manage, creating a cascade of impacts that rolled across the target like thunder. This wasn't that. Every single shell arrived at exactly the same instant. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The world exploded. Where moments before there had been American foxholes and defensive positions, there was now a wall of fire and steel that consumed everything within a 200-meter circle. Not a creeping barrage that gave defenders time to take cover. Not a sequential bombardment where shells walked across the landscape. Every projectile in the salvo struck within a fraction of a second of every other projectile. The mathematics were impossible. Hartmann had calculated the trajectories in his mind even as he took cover. Artillery shells from different guns, even guns in the same battery, should arrive at different times, because they were fired from different positions at different moments. The farther the gun from the target, the longer the time of flight. A shell fired from 3 kilometers away takes perhaps 15 seconds to reach its target. A shell fired from 4 kilometers takes perhaps 18 or 19 seconds. Even if 2 guns fired simultaneously, their shells would arrive seconds apart. Unless unless someone had calculated the exact time of flight from each individual gun to the target, and then coordinated the firing so that shells launched at different moments all arrived at the same instant. The thought was absurd. The mathematical precision required was beyond anything the German army attempted. You would need accurate survey data for every gun position. You would need precise calculations of time of flight, accounting for range, elevation, and propellant temperature. You would need reliable communications to synchronize dozens of gun crews across kilometers of terrain. You would need them all to fire at exact predetermined moments, staggered by seconds, so that shells traveling different distances would converge on the target simultaneously. It was theoretically possible, but no army on Earth actually did it. The Americans apparently did it. The barrage lifted after 30 seconds, leaving nothing but smoke and shattered earth where the forward American positions had been. Hartman stood slowly, his ears ringing, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. He had been calling in artillery fire for 3 years. He had seen the massive German siege guns reduce the fortress of Sevastopol to rubble. He had cowered under Soviet artillery bombardments, where hundreds of guns fired for hours. He had observed the methodical German doctrine of artillery support, careful, professional, economical with ammunition. This was something else. This was mathematics made lethal. This was industrial coordination applied to the ancient art of artillery. This was American. Before Hartman could fully collect his thoughts, his field telephone buzzed. The regimental commander's voice was tense. All observers be advised. Enemy counterattack forming in your sector. Multiple reports of armor and infantry movement. Stand by to call fire missions. Hartman moved back to his observation position and scanned the valley through his scissors telescope. Through the smoke and snow, he could see them. American infantry rising from positions he hadn't even known were there, advancing in squad rushes while Sherman tanks provided covering fire. Behind them, perhaps 2 kilometers distant, he could see what looked like artillery positions, though from this angle he couldn't get an accurate count. He reached for his telephone to call in coordinates when the world exploded again. This time there was no warning whistle. One instant the forest around his bunker was quiet except for the crack of rifle fire from the valley below. The next instant shells were impacting everywhere. On the ridge behind him where the German assault companies waited. In the clearing to his left where a mortar section had been setting up. On the road junction 400 meters back where a supply truck had just pulled up. And still, impossibly, they all hit at exactly the same time. Time on target. That's what the Americans called it, though Hartman wouldn't learn the term until weeks later when he sat in a prisoner of war cage, comparing notes with other captured German officers who had survived similar experiences. Time on target, TOT for short, a firing technique developed by American artillery schools where batteries calculated the precise moment each gun needed to fire, so that all shells converged on the target simultaneously. The Americans had turned it into standard doctrine. They trained every artillery battalion to execute TOT fires. They had the radios, the fire direction centers, the mathematical tables, and the coordination, to do it not just occasionally as a technical demonstration, but routinely, as ordinary operational procedure. The German army, for all its tactical sophistication and operational excellence, had nothing equivalent. Hartman knew with cold certainty that he needed to understand what was happening, how many guns were firing, what type, how quickly could they shift targets. These weren't academic questions. His life and the lives of every German soldier in this sector depended on the answers. He began counting the shell bursts during the next barrage, trying to distinguish individual impacts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He lost count at somewhere around 30 before the bombardment lifted. 30 shells arriving simultaneously. That meant at minimum 30 guns, probably divided among 3 or 4 battalions. But the Americans didn't just have 30 guns. Through a gap in the smoke, Hartman caught a glimpse of the American artillery positions. Row after row of howitzers, arranged with geometric precision in what American doctrine called battalion firing positions. He estimated 20 batteries visible from his vantage point? Possibly. More hidden by terrain? If each battery had the standard 6 guns? No, that couldn't be right. The Americans didn't use 6-gun batteries like the Germans. He had read the intelligence summaries. American artillery battalions had 3 batteries of 4 guns each, 12 guns total. If he was seeing 20 batteries, that meant at least 80 howitzers in immediate supporting range of this one sector of the front. 80 guns. The entire 212th Volksgrenadier Division had perhaps 30 artillery pieces of all calibers combined, and most of those were horse-drawn, slowly repositioning after each fire mission to avoid counter-battery fire. The Americans had 80 modern truck-towed howitzers in this sector alone, and from what Hartman had observed, they weren't moving between shots. They were staying in position, firing continuously, apparently unconcerned about German counter-battery fire, because they knew the Luftwaffe couldn't spot them, and German artillery didn't have enough ammunition to engage in sustained counter-battery duels. The mathematics became even more disturbing when Hartman considered rate of fire. The German Lef H-18 could fire perhaps 4 to 6 rounds per minute sustained. The intelligence briefs claimed the American M2A1 105mm Howitzer could fire up to 10 rounds per minute for short periods. Hartman had dismissed these claims as obvious exaggerations. No gun crew could possibly sustain that rate of fire. But if it were true, 80 guns, each firing 10 rounds per minute, concentrated on a target area roughly the size of a football field. That was 800 shells per minute, over 13 shells every single second, for as long as the Americans chose to keep firing. Hartman's mind refused to accept the calculation. 13 shells per second was absurd. That was more artillery fire than entire German divisions could generate. That was the kind of concentration you might see for a few minutes during a major offensive preparation, draining ammunition reserves for days afterward. The Americans appeared to be doing it casually, as routine fire support for what looked like a company-sized attack. The next Tachot barrage caught the German assault companies as they tried to reposition. Hartman, still in his forward observation bunker, could only watch as the entire ridgeline behind him erupted in synchronized destruction. Trees exploded. The ground heaved. Men simply vanished, not because they were hit by shell fragments, but because the sheer concussion turned their organs to jelly inside their bodies. When the barrage lifted, after perhaps 45 seconds, Hartman estimated that 2 full companies had ceased to exist as coherent fighting units. Not routed, not retreating in disorder, simply ceased to exist. The survivors were scattered, shell-shocked, incapable of coordinated action. The American infantry hadn't even reached the German positions yet, and the battle was effectively over. Hartman had one more duty to perform. He needed to report what he had seen to headquarters. He needed to tell someone that the Americans possessed an artillery capability that exceeded anything German doctrine had prepared them to face. He reached for his field telephone, but the line was dead, cut by shell fire, somewhere along the kilometers of wire strung through the forest. He was trying to decide whether to risk running to the rear to find a working telephone when the next barrage came in. This time the Americans adjusted their fire onto his observation position. Perhaps they had spotted his bunker. Perhaps they were simply walking their fire across every possible position that could hold German troops. It didn't matter. Hartmann had perhaps 2 seconds of warning, just enough time to realize what was happening, before 33-pound high-explosive shells began detonating all around him. The bunker's logs absorbed the first few blasts. Then a shell landed close enough that the concussion blew out the firing slit, and Hartmann found himself tumbling backward, his ears bleeding, his vision swimming with dark spots. Another blast, so close he felt the heat, and part of the roof collapsed, showering him with frozen earth and shattered timber. When consciousness returned, seconds or minutes later, Hartmann couldn't tell. He found himself partially buried, unable to move his left leg, tasting blood in his mouth. The bombardment continued, but it had shifted away from his immediate position. Through the gaps in the collapsed bunker, he could see shell bursts walking across the forest, methodically destroying every German position within a kilometer of the front line. He tried to move and discovered his leg wasn't just trapped, it was almost certainly broken. The pain came in waves, competing with the ringing in his ears and the throbbing ache behind his eyes. He was going to die here, buried in a collapsed bunker, killed not by a bullet or a direct shell hit, but by the industrial mathematics of American artillery fire. That's when he heard the voices. American voices speaking English, calling to each other as infantry squads moved through the shattered forest, checking for survivors. Hartmann understood enough English to recognize the tone, professional, alert, but not frenzied. These were soldiers performing a dangerous task with workmanlike competence, not men caught up in the heat of battle fury. An American face appeared in the gap of the collapsed bunker roof, young, maybe 20 years old, with the helmet and field jacket of a U.S. Army infantryman. The soldier saw Hartmann, raised his rifle, then lowered it when he realized the German officer was unarmed and trapped. "Medic!" the American called. "Got a live one here." More faces appeared. Hands began pulling away debris, clearing an opening large enough for Hartmann to be extracted. Someone gave him water from a canteen. Someone else began cutting away his boot to examine his mangled leg. The same leg that had carried him through 3 years of war was going to cost him his service, possibly his life, if infection set in. But he was alive. Against all probability, after experiencing the concentrated fire of what he estimated to be more than 2,000 artillery shells in less than 10 minutes, Klaus Hartmann was still alive and conscious enough to think. And what he thought about, as American medics applied a splint and prepared to evacuate him to an aid station, was how thoroughly unprepared the German army had been for this kind of firepower. How completely the intelligence summaries had failed to convey the reality. How all the training and doctrine and operational art that had served Germany so well against the French, the British, the Russians, had not accounted for an enemy who could bring the resources of an entire industrialized continent to bear on a small forest in Belgium. The American medic gave him a shot of morphine, and as the drug took effect, Hartmann's thoughts began to drift. He remembered reading years ago about American industrial production statistics, numbers so large they seemed like propaganda, thousands of tanks per month, tens of thousands of aircraft per year, ammunition production measured in millions of rounds. He had dismissed those numbers as obviously inflated, the kind of statistics that losing sides invented to explain their defeats. But if the Americans could concentrate 80 howitzers on a single sector of a secondary front, if they could fire 13 shells per second for as long as they wanted, if they could coordinate that fire with mathematical precision that turned artillery from an area weapon into a point target destroyer, then maybe the production numbers weren't inflated at all. Maybe American industry really could produce artillery ammunition faster than German factories could produce guns. Maybe American logistics really could keep frontline units supplied with thousands of shells per day, while German units scraped by on rationed ammunition. Maybe the overwhelming firepower he had just experienced wasn't a special effort, wasn't a dramatic demonstration, wasn't even particularly remarkable by American standards. Maybe this was just a Thursday for them. The American medics loaded Hartmann onto a stretcher and began carrying him toward the rear. As they walked, he could hear it starting again, the roar of American artillery falling on German positions deeper in the forest, concentrated, synchronized, mathematically precise. He had survived 3 years of war by understanding the battlefield, by learning the patterns of combat, by calculating angles and trajectories and rates of fire. He had thought he understood artillery warfare as well as any soldier in any army. He had been wrong. The Americans had industrialized destruction in ways the German army never imagined. They had taken the craft of artillery, an ancient trade practiced by skilled gunners who took pride in their accuracy and efficiency, and transformed it into a mass production system. They fired shells the way American factories produced automobiles, quickly, precisely, and in numbers that made any attempt at parity simply absurd. 105mm Howitzers, the M2A1. A gun so ordinary, so standard, so unremarkable in the American arsenal that they had produced more than 10,000 of them. 10,000 identical guns, manufactured to precise standards, equipped with identical fire control systems, supported by millions of rounds of standardized ammunition. The Wehrmacht had nothing comparable. Oh, German artillery was good, technically sophisticated, crewed by well-trained soldiers, employed according to sound tactical doctrine. But the Germans produced artillery pieces by the hundreds, not thousands. They fired them carefully, conserving ammunition because there would never be enough. They moved them frequently because they couldn't afford to lose guns to counter battery fire. The Americans just fired and fired and fired because they could, because they had so much ammunition that rationing was unnecessary, because they had so many guns that losing a few to counter battery fire was acceptable, because they had surveyed their positions and calculated their trajectories and practiced their procedures until they could drop 1,000 shells on a target the size of a city block, and do it so precisely that every single shell arrived at the exact same instant. Time on target. It wasn't just a tactical technique. It was a philosophy. It was a demonstration of industrial might translated into military power. It was America saying, in the language of high explosives and mathematical precision, we have so much of everything that we can afford to use it all at once, concentrated in time and space, delivered with overwhelming force at the exact moment we choose. The Germans had talked about blitzkrieg, lightning war, combined arms operations that coordinated tanks, infantry, and air power with speed and precision. It had been remarkably effective in 1940, 41, even 42. But what the Americans were doing in 1945 was something else entirely. Not lightning war. This was industrial war, factory war, mass production war. This was what happened when an enemy had so much of everything that quality almost didn't matter, because quantity became its own form of quality. Hartmann remembered a conversation from months earlier, back when the division was still preparing for what Hitler promised would be the decisive winter offensive. One of the older officers, a man who had fought in the First War, had tried to explain what American intervention meant. "They're like a machine," the officer had said. "Once they get rolling, they don't stop. They don't get tired. They don't run out of supplies. They just grind forward, replacing losses faster than you can inflict them, bringing up reserves faster than you can identify them, firing more shells than you can count." Hartmann hadn't really understood then. He had still been thinking in terms of German operational concepts: maneuver, flexibility, tactical excellence compensating for material shortfalls. He thought superior German tactics could defeat American material advantages. Now he understood. Tactics didn't matter when the enemy could drop 800 shells per minute on your position. Maneuver didn't matter when American artillery could track your movements and deliver time-on-target fires faster than you could reposition. Superior training didn't matter when the Americans had so many guns that they didn't need to be particularly good with any individual gun. They just needed to coordinate them all, which they did with radios and fire direction centers and mathematical tables. The American medics carried Hartmann past a captured German artillery position. The guns were still there, abandoned by their crews during the bombardment. Hartmann recognized them. 105mm LEFH-18 Howitzers, the standard German divisional artillery piece. Good guns, reliable, accurate when properly handled. There were 4 of them. 4 German guns in this position. 80 American guns in the sector, 20-1. And that was just the ratio in this one small section of a front that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. How many more American artillery pieces were there? Hundreds? Thousands? How much ammunition? Enough that they could fire continuous TOT missions for days? Weeks? One of the American soldiers guarding the captured German guns noticed Hartmann looking at them. The soldier, a corporal, maybe 22 years old, grinned. "Those yours?" he asked in thickly accented but comprehensible German. "Not bad guns. We captured a bunch of them back in France. Some of our guys actually prefer them to our own 75s. Longer range, better accuracy." Hartmann managed a weak nod. The morphine was making everything a bit unreal, but he tried to focus. "How many guns do you have?" he asked in English. The corporal shrugged. "In this sector? I don't know, man. Couple battalions worth. Maybe 5, 6 battalions, something like that. We got plenty more where those came from. 5 or 6 battalions. At 12 guns per battalion, that was 60 to 72 guns, close to Hartmann's estimate. But the casual way the American said it, couple battalions, plenty more where those came from, suggested that this concentration wasn't unusual. This was just normal artillery support for a counterattack against a relatively minor German offensive in a relatively quiet sector of the front. What would it be like when the Americans launched a major offensive? When they really committed their full strength? When they brought up not 5 or 6 battalions, but 50 or 60? Hartmann didn't want to imagine it, but he couldn't help calculating. 60 battalions would be 720 guns, firing 10 rounds per minute each. 7,200 shells per minute. 120 shells every single second. Enough high explosive to physically reshape the landscape. Enough steel to turn a kilometer of forest into something resembling the surface of the moon. The numbers stopped being meaningful. They became abstract. When you can fire 120 heavy shells per second, you're no longer using artillery as a tactical weapon. You're using it as a strategic weapon, as a force of nature, as a means of simply deleting whatever exists in a particular location. The Americans reached their aid station, a collection of tents set up in a sheltered valley, safe from German artillery fire, because the Germans didn't have enough artillery to threaten American rear areas. More medics appeared, examining Hartmann's injuries, asking him questions in careful German. An aid station, not a field hospital. These were forward elements, the first link in a medical evacuation chain that would eventually carry wounded soldiers all the way back to hospitals in England or even America. Even the medical system was industrialized. Hartmann had seen German field hospitals where doctors worked by candlelight with improvised equipment, performing surgery with tools meant for other purposes because proper surgical instruments weren't available. This American aid station, by contrast, looked like a well-equipped civilian hospital that happened to be in a tent. Bright electric lights powered by a portable generator. Proper surgical instruments laid out on sterile trays. Blood plasma and morphine and sulfa drugs in quantities that suggested unlimited supply. Everything about the Americans suggested unlimited supply. A doctor came by. A captain, probably in his mid-30s, with the confident manner of someone who had performed this examination hundreds of times. He examined Hartman's leg, made some notes on a clipboard, gave orders to the medics that Hartman couldn't quite follow. "You'll keep the leg," the doctor said in adequate German. "Compound fracture, but nothing we can't fix. You'll be in a cast for a few months. After that, well, the war will probably be over by then anyway. After that, the war will probably be over." Said so casually, as though it were obvious fact rather than speculation, as though the Americans knew with absolute certainty that German defeat was inevitable, was just a matter of timing now, was something to plan logistics around rather than fight to prevent. Maybe they did know. Maybe when you could concentrate 80 howitzers on a single sector and fire 13 shells per second for as long as you wanted, maybe then you did know. Maybe then victory wasn't a hope or a strategy, but simply a foregone conclusion, just a question of how much time and resources you wanted to spend achieving it. Hartman closed, his eyes letting the morphine pull him under into something approaching sleep. His last conscious thought was about numbers, about the mathematics of industrial warfare, about how Germany had started this war believing in tactical excellence and operational art and strategic audacity, believing that superior German soldiers using superior German tactics could overcome material disadvantages. It had worked for a while, against Poland, against France, even against Russia in the early years when Soviet forces were still reeling from Stalin's purges, and German supply lines were still manageable. But America wasn't Poland or France or even Russia. America was something else. America was what happened when an entire continent's worth of industrial capacity got organized and focused on a single purpose. America was what happened when factories that once produced tractors and automobiles started producing tanks and trucks instead at a rate of thousands per month. America was what happened when a country with vast steel mills and endless coal mines and oil fields that stretched for hundreds of miles decided to turn all of that industrial might into military power. And the 105mm Howitzer, the ordinary, standard, unremarkable M2A1, was the perfect symbol of that power. Not the biggest gun, not the most advanced gun. Just a simple, reliable, mass-produced piece of artillery that American factories could turn out by the thousands. 10,000 of them. Enough that American artillery battalions could fire continuously for days without worrying about ammunition shortages. Enough that losing a few guns to enemy fire was an acceptable tactical loss rather than a devastating blow. Enough that American commanders could use artillery fire the way German commanders used rifle fire, as a routine, ordinary, always available tactical tool. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American doctrine even had a name for it. Hartman had seen it in captured documents. They called it Time on Target Concentration, TOT for short. But it was more than just a firing technique. It was a philosophy of war that said, we have so much of everything that we can afford to use it all at once, delivered with overwhelming force at the exact moment we choose, coordinated with mathematical precision across dozens of guns and kilometers of terrain. The Germans had never developed anything comparable because they couldn't afford to. German artillery doctrine emphasized careful fire control, economic use of ammunition, precise targeting of specific threats. German gun crews were trained to be efficient, to make every shell count, because there would never be enough shells. The Americans just had more shells. So many more shells that efficiency became irrelevant. Why carefully target individual enemy positions when you could simply saturate an entire area with fire? Why conserve ammunition when the supply trucks could bring up more faster than you could fire it? As consciousness faded, Hartmann had one final thought, one final calculation that his artillery observer's brain couldn't help but make. 10,000 M2A1 howitzers. If even half of them were in action at any given time, 5,000 guns, firing 10 rounds per minute sustained, 50,000 shells per minute across the entire Western Front, 833 shells per second. That wasn't artillery anymore. That was a force of nature. That was what absolute industrial dominance looked like when translated into military power. That was what happened when an army had such overwhelming material superiority that tactical excellence became almost irrelevant. The German army had started this war with tactical advantages: better tanks, better tactics, better trained soldiers. Those advantages had been real in 1940. But it was 1945 now, and tactical advantages meant nothing when the enemy could fire 800 shells per second. Klaus Hartmann slept, and as he slept, the American artillery continued its methodical work, firing precisely calculated time on target missions, delivering tons of high explosive with mathematical precision, grinding German positions into powder with industrial efficiency. The war would continue for another 4 months until May, when Germany finally surrendered. But for Hartmann, the war effectively ended on January 3, 1945, in a bunker in the Ardennes forest, when he learned what American artillery could do, what 105mm Howitzers could do when you had 10,000 of them. When Hartmann woke, he was in a proper hospital tent, his leg elevated and encased in plaster, the sharp pain replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. An American nurse, a woman, which surprised him, was checking his temperature. She smiled when she saw he was awake. "Welcome back, Lieutenant," she said in English. "You've been out for about 12 hours. How's the pain?" Hartmann tried to answer, but his throat was too dry. The nurse brought water, helped him drink, then adjusted his pillow so he could sit up slightly. Around him, the tent held perhaps 20 beds, most occupied by wounded soldiers, both American and German. The Germans were mixed in with the Americans, receiving the same care, the same attention from the medical staff. "Where am I?" Hartmann managed to ask in English. "Field hospital, about 10 miles behind the front," the nurse replied. "You'll be here for a few days while we stabilize you. Then you're going to a POW facility in France. After that, probably England or even the States, depending on bed availability." The States, America itself, a country Hartmann had only seen in propaganda films, always portrayed as weak, decadent, incapable of real military effort. A country that was supposedly on the verge of collapse, under the weight of its racial mixing and democratic chaos. A country that Nazi propaganda had assured him could never match German military power. A country that had just demonstrated it could fire 13 shells per second with mathematical precision. Over the next 3 days, as Hartmann recovered enough strength to be moved, he began talking with other German prisoners in the hospital. They came from different units: Volksgrenadier divisions, panzer units, paratroopers, even a few SS men who kept to themselves at one end of the tent. But they all had similar stories. A Hauptmann, from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend described being hit by an American artillery barrage while his tanks were refueling. "We heard it coming," he said, still shaken days later. But all the shells arrived at once, not one after another like normal artillery, all at once. My entire company gone in 30 seconds. Tanks destroyed, crews killed, fuel trucks exploding. I was thrown clear by a blast, woke up surrounded by Americans. A lieutenant from the 5th Parachute Division talked about being in a defensive position near Bastogne when the weather cleared and American fighter bombers appeared. "They didn't even need to strafe us," he said bitterly. "They just radioed our coordinates to their artillery. 2 minutes later, every position we held simply ceased to exist. Time on target, they call it. Target on time would be more accurate. They hit exactly when and where they wanted." An artillery officer from a Volks Artillery Corps unit shared the most disturbing information. "I was in the Fire Direction Center when we got intelligence reports about American ammunition expenditure," he said quietly. "During their attack on the 16th of December, in just the first 2 hours, American artillery units fired more than 40,000 rounds. 40,000. Our entire corps had been rationed to 3,000 rounds per week. Hartmann did the mathematics automatically. 40,000 rounds in 2 hours meant more than 300 rounds per minute, sustained. That aligned with his own observations, 80 guns firing constantly. But the broader implication was worse. If the Americans could expend 40,000 rounds in 2 hours during what was essentially a defensive action, how much ammunition did they have in total? How much were they producing? The artillery officer seemed to read his thoughts. The intelligence summary estimated American artillery ammunition production at more than 100 million rounds per year. Just for the 105mm alone. 100 million. The number was incomprehensible. Hartmann tried to put it in context. The Wehrmacht's total artillery ammunition production for all calibers had peaked at perhaps 15 million rounds per year in 1943, and had been declining since due to Allied bombing and resource shortages. The Americans were producing 7 times that much for a single type of gun. "They have 10,000 of those howitzers," Hartmann said quietly. "The M2A1, 10,000 identical guns." The artillery officer nodded. "Plus thousands of larger pieces, 155mm guns, 8-inch howitzers. And that's just the artillery. Their tank production is worse. More tanks per month than we produce in a year. Their aircraft production makes our Luftwaffe look like a flying club." A younger soldier, an Obergefreiter who had been listening, finally spoke up. "How is this possible? We were told America was weak, that they couldn't match German quality, that their soldiers were poorly trained conscripts who would break at the first real test." No one answered immediately. What could they say? That the propaganda had been lies? That German intelligence had failed to comprehend the scale of American industrial power? That the entire strategic premise of the war, that German tactical excellence could overcome Allied material advantages, had been fundamentally flawed? Hartmann thought about his own indoctrination, the years of propaganda he had absorbed almost unconsciously. America as a mongrel nation, weakened by racial mixing. America as a plutocracy, controlled by Jewish financiers who cared nothing for military strength. America as a nation of soft civilians who would never accept the sacrifices necessary for total war. Every bit of it had been wrong. America wasn't weak because of its diversity. It was strong because of its size. It had 130 million people, more than the entire Greater German Reich, including occupied territories. America wasn't controlled by financiers. It was industrialized to a degree that made even German factories look primitive. And American civilians hadn't rejected war. They had mobilized for it completely, transforming their entire economy to military production with a speed and efficiency that exceeded even German mobilization. The 105mm Howitzer was just one example. American factories had produced 10,000 of them since 1941. That was an average of more than 200 per month, every month, for 4 years. And those factories were also producing tanks, trucks, aircraft, ships, ammunition, uniforms, rations, medical supplies, everything an army needed, in quantities that defied comprehension. Germany, by contrast, had produced perhaps 1,500 artillery pieces per year at peak production, less than half the monthly American production of just one type of gun. And German production was falling due to Allied bombing, raw material shortages, and the diversion of resources to air defense and rocket weapons that consumed huge amounts of resources while delivering minimal military value. On his 4th day in the hospital, an American officer came to interview Hartmann. Not an interrogator. Those had already asked their tactical questions about unit positions and strength. This was an intelligence officer, a captain in his late 20s who seemed genuinely curious about German perspectives. "You were an artillery observer," the captain said, consulting his notes. 3 years' experience, Russian front and Italy. What did you think of our artillery? Hartmann considered lying, maintaining the facade of German superiority. But what was the point? The war was effectively over. Germany was going to lose, probably within months. The only question was how many more soldiers would die before the inevitable surrender. "Your time on target technique," Hartmann said carefully. "It's remarkable. We have nothing comparable. The coordination required, the mathematical precision, the communications. It's beyond what we can do." The captain nodded, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. "Do you know how it works?" "I understand the principle. Each gun calculates its time of flight to the target, then fires at a precise moment so all shells arrive simultaneously. But the practical implementation, coordinating dozens of guns across kilometers of terrain, all firing at different times but synchronized, I don't understand how you manage it." "Fire direction centers," the captain explained. "Every battalion has one, usually 3 officers and 6 enlisted men with radios, telephones, and mathematical tables. When we get a fire mission, the FDC calculates everything, range, deflection, time of flight for each battery. Then they broadcast a countdown. Each gun crew knows exactly when to fire. It's not magic. It's just math and good communications. Just math and good communications. As if those were simple things, easily achieved. But of course, to the Americans they were. Math meant universal education. Soldiers who had graduated from high schools where they learned trigonometry and algebra. Communications meant radios in every vehicle, telephones laid to every position, a logistics system that kept batteries supplied and maintained. None of it was individually remarkable. Together, it was devastating. "How much ammunition do you have?" Hartmann asked, knowing the question would probably go unanswered, but unable to stop himself from asking. The captain smiled. "Enough. Let me put it this way. My battalion fired 800 rounds yesterday in support of a company-sized attack. That's not unusual. We'll fire the same today, the same tomorrow. Our supply units keep us stocked. I've never heard of a fire mission being denied because of ammunition shortages. Never. Not once in 2 years of combat. 800 rounds per day per battalion, continuously, with no concern for ammunition conservation." Hartmann's mind reeled. His German artillery battalion had been rationed to perhaps 100 rounds per week during the Ardennes offensive, and even that had been considered generous by late 1944 standards. "Your production," Hartman began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase the question. "Is larger than you were told," the captain finished. "I know what German intelligence estimated. I've read captured documents. You thought we were producing maybe 5,000 Howitzers total? Try 10,000 just of the 105mm. Add another 3,155mm pieces, plus all the tank guns, anti-aircraft guns, anti-tank guns, mortars. And that's just artillery. Our tank production is about the same as our artillery production, more than 2,000 per month. 2,000 tanks per month." Hartman had seen German production estimates. The Reich was producing perhaps 300 tanks per month in late 1944, and that number was falling due to bombing and resource shortages. The Americans were producing nearly 7 times as many, and their production wasn't falling. It was still increasing. "How?" Hartman asked simply. "How do you produce so much?" The captain thought for a moment, as if trying to explain something so obvious to him that he had never really considered it. "Mass production techniques, assembly lines, standardization. We don't hand-build things like European factories do. We design a product, create tooling for it, then manufacture thousands of identical copies. Ford was making cars that way back in 1914. We just applied the same principles to military equipment." "But the quality," Hartman began, about to repeat what he had been taught about American mass production resulting in inferior equipment. "Is adequate," the captain interrupted. "The M4 Sherman isn't as good as your Panther or Tiger. Individual unit versus individual unit, your tank probably wins. But we make 20 Shermans for every Panther you make. And our Shermans are reliable. They don't break down every 50 miles. They don't need specialized parts that take months to manufacture. A Sherman breaks, we fix it in a day with parts that fit every other Sherman. Your tanks break, you need custom parts that maybe don't exist anymore because the factory that made them got bombed." It was the same principle as the 105mm Howitzer. Not the best gun, not the most advanced gun, but good enough. Produced in overwhelming numbers, supported by a logistics system that ensured parts and ammunition were always available. Quantity as its own form of quality. "What about your soldiers?" Hartman asked. "We were told American soldiers were poorly trained, unwilling to fight, soft from civilian life." The captain laughed, though not unkindly. "You're asking the wrong guy. I'm a farm kid from Iowa. Volunteered in 42, went through officer candidate school, spent 6 months training with my battalion before we deployed. I'm about as average as American soldiers get. We're not supermen, but we're adequately trained, we're well equipped, and we know we're winning. Morale is pretty good when you never have to worry about food, ammunition, or air support." That was the key, wasn't it? German soldiers were often superior individually, better trained, more experienced, more ideologically committed. But German soldiers were fighting on empty stomachs with inadequate ammunition, while American aircraft controlled the skies. American soldiers might be less skilled individually, but they had so many advantages that individual skill mattered less. The captain stood to leave, then paused. "Can I ask you something? Off the record?" Hartman nodded. "When did you know you were going to lose?" Hartman thought back. "To the Eastern Front in 42, when the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad turned what was supposed to be a final victory into a desperate retreat. To Italy in 43, when Allied naval and air power made it impossible to supply German positions. to Normandy in 44, when the scale of the Allied invasion made it clear that German forces couldn't hold the Atlantic Wall. But honestly, he had known before all of that. 41, Hartman said quietly. When we declared war on America. The moment I heard that, I knew. Maybe not consciously, but somewhere deep down, I knew. You don't fight the country that produces half the world's steel and expect to win. The captain nodded slowly. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it had to play out this way. You seem like a decent guy. Lots of German prisoners do. It's a shame so many good men on both sides had to die for. He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. For what? For Hitler's delusions of conquest? For the Nazi dream of racial supremacy? For German nationalism that couldn't accept the outcome of the First War? Hartman had his own answers, but he kept them to himself. After the captain left, Hartman lay in his bed, staring at the tent ceiling, thinking about mathematics. Not the mathematics of artillery fire, but the mathematics of industrial production. The numbers that had actually determined this war long before any shots were fired. America, 130 million people. Germany, 80 million. Even if you added in occupied territories, Germany couldn't match American population. And population meant industrial workers, soldiers, farmers to feed everyone. America. More steel production than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. Steel meant tanks, ships, aircraft, guns, ammunition. The country with more steel won. America. Oil fields in Texas that produced more petroleum than all of Europe and Asia combined. Oil meant trucks, tanks, aircraft, ships. Modern war was fought with oil. Germany had been running on fumes since 1941, using synthetic fuel that required enormous industrial capacity to produce and provided less performance than natural petroleum. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Germany had been outproduced from the start. German tactical excellence had compensated for material shortfalls in the early years, but eventually, sheer industrial capacity had won. America had simply manufactured victory, produced more guns, more shells, more tanks, more aircraft, more everything, until German skill and courage became irrelevant in the face of overwhelming material superiority. And the 105mm Howitzer was the perfect symbol of that victory. 10,000 identical guns, each capable of firing 10 rounds per minute, each supported by a logistics system that ensured ammunition was always available. Not superweapons, not secret technologies, just good, reliable, mass-produced artillery pieces backed by American industrial might. Hartman wondered what would happen to him now. Prisoner of war camps, probably in England or America itself. Then what? Germany would lose, probably before summer. Would he be repatriated to a defeated Germany? A occupied Germany? What would the country even look like after unconditional surrender? He didn't know, but he knew this. He had survived. He had survived 3 years of war against the Soviets, months in Italy and France, and the terrible winter offensive in the Ardennes. He had survived German tactical excellence colliding with American material superiority. He had survived learning that everything he had been told about the enemy was wrong. That was worth something. 2 days later, American medics loaded Hartman onto a truck for transport to a POW facility in France. As the truck drove through the Belgian countryside, he could see the evidence of American logistics everywhere. Entire fields had been transformed into supply depots, row after row of crates and barrels and boxes stacked with geometric precision. Convoys of trucks stretched for kilometers, carrying supplies forward to frontline units. Artillery parks held dozens of guns, not hidden in forests, but positioned openly in cleared fields, because the Luftwaffe was so weak that the Americans didn't fear air attack. At one point, the truck stopped at a crossroads to let a convoy pass. Hartman counted the vehicles. 40 trucks, all identical, all new, all carrying crates marked with American military insignia. The soldier guarding the prisoners, a corporal, maybe 19 years old, saw him counting and grinned. "That's just one supply convoy," the corporal said in fractured German. "There's probably 50 more on the road right now. Ammunition, fuel, rations, medical supplies, spare parts, everything an army needs. We got plenty. Too much, really. Sometimes we don't even know what to do with it all. Too much." The Germans had spent years fighting with too little. Too little ammunition, too little fuel, too little food, too little everything. The Americans had so much they didn't know what to do with it all. That, in the end, was what had determined this war. Not courage or tactics or ideology or military skill. Just industrial capacity, just mathematics, just the cold calculation of resources and production and logistics. Germany had lost because America simply made more of everything. The truck reached the POW facility near Reims, a former French military camp now repurposed to hold German prisoners. Hartman was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, assigned a prisoner number. With the same efficient American professionalism he had seen everywhere. The camp held perhaps 2,000 German prisoners, with more arriving daily as the front collapsed. In the camp, Hartman met German soldiers from every branch and every front. Luftwaffe pilots who had seen their squadrons reduced to nothing by American fighter superiority and fuel shortages. U-boat crews who had survived the slaughter in the Atlantic after the Allies broke the Enigma codes and developed escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft. Panzer soldiers who had watched their superior tanks immobilized by lack of fuel while American Shermans kept fighting because American supply lines never failed. Every story was different in the details, but the same in the essentials. German skill and courage hadn't been enough to overcome American material advantages. The Wehrmacht had been outproduced, outgunned, and overwhelmed by an enemy that could afford to absorb losses and keep fighting because replacement equipment and soldiers arrived faster than losses accumulated. One evening in March, as word came that American forces had crossed the Rhine, Hartman sat with a group of other officers discussing what had gone wrong. A panzer commander from the 5th Panzer Army spoke passionately about tactical errors and strategic blunders. A Luftwaffe officer blamed Goering for destroying German air power through incompetent leadership. An SS officer, one of the few who would speak honestly, blamed Hitler for refusing to allow tactical withdrawals that might have preserved German forces for counterattacks. They were all partially right. German leadership had made many mistakes, but Hartman had come to a different conclusion. "We lost in the factories," he said quietly. "Everything else was just details." The group looked at him questioningly. "Think about it," Hartman continued. "Every tactical victory we won just delayed the inevitable. We could win 10 battles, and it didn't matter because the Americans just brought up more equipment and tried again. We lost one battle, and the equipment lost couldn't be replaced. The war wasn't decided on battlefields. It was decided in American factories building 10,000 howitzers while we built 1,500. In American oil fields producing the fuel that kept their armies mobile while we scraped by on synthetic substitutes. In American shipyards building more ships than all of Europe combined. But German quality, the panzer commander began. "Didn't matter," Hartman interrupted. "Not in the long run. Yes, a Panther is better than a Sherman, but they made 20 Shermans for every Panther. Yes, the LEFH-18 is an excellent gun, but they made 10,000 M2A1s. At some point, quantity becomes quality. When the enemy can fire 13 shells, Per second with mathematical precision, your superior gun handling skills are irrelevant. The group fell silent. It was a bitter truth, one that challenged everything they had believed about German military superiority. But it was truth nonetheless. In April, news came that American and Soviet forces had linked up at the Elbe River. Germany was cut in half. In the camp, prisoners listened to smuggled radio broadcasts, BBC mostly, since German radio had become nothing but propaganda and Wagner operas. The news was uniformly bad. Berlin surrounded, Hitler dead in his bunker, Admiral Dönitz assuming leadership of a Reich that existed now in name only. On May 7th, 1945, the announcement came. Germany had signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Prisoners reacted differently. Some wept. Some seemed relieved. Some maintained that Germany would rise again, that this was just a temporary setback. Hartmann felt mostly numb. 3 years of war had ended not with the dramatic last stand that propaganda had promised, but with administrative paperwork and signatures on surrender documents. The Americans began processing prisoners for repatriation, a massive administrative effort to return millions of German soldiers to a country that barely existed anymore. Hartmann learned he would be sent to a temporary camp in Germany, then released once the occupation authorities determined he posed no security threat. It would take months. During that time, as he waited, Hartmann had many opportunities to speak with American soldiers. Most were friendly, curious about German perspectives, eager to trade stories about the war. One conversation stuck with him. It was with a sergeant from an artillery battalion, an older man, perhaps 35, who had been in the army since before Pearl Harbor. They had been discussing the 105mm Howitzer, the gun that had shattered Hartmann's understanding of modern warfare. "You know what's funny?" the sergeant said. "That gun almost didn't get adopted. Back before the war, the Army was fighting about whether to standardize on the 105 or stick with the old 75mm. The 105 was heavier, more expensive, used more ammunition. Some guys argued it was overkill, that the 75 was adequate." "What changed their minds?" Hartmann asked. "Production capacity," the sergeant replied. "Once we realized we could make thousands of them, the cost argument went away. Who cares if one gun costs 3 times as much as another if you can make enough for every division? And the ammunition issue, same thing. We knew we could produce millions of rounds, so we went with the heavier, more capable gun because we could, because American industry made it possible." There it was again, the fundamental difference. German military planners had to design around scarcity. Lighter guns, because heavy guns used too much ammunition. Synthetic fuel, because natural petroleum wasn't available. Horse-drawn transport, because motorized vehicles required too much fuel and maintenance. Every German military decision was a compromise between what was desired and what was possible given limited resources. American military planners designed around abundance. Heavier guns because they could produce the ammunition. Motorized divisions because they had the fuel. Massive air forces because they could build enough aircraft. The Americans didn't need to compromise. They could just make more of whatever they needed. "What will you do?" the sergeant asked. "After you're released?" Hartmann thought about it. Return to a defeated Germany, find his family, if they had survived, perhaps go back to university. He had been studying mathematics before the war. Try to rebuild a life in whatever emerged from the ruins of the Reich. "Start over," he said finally. "Learn from this. Make sure we never do this again." The sergeant nodded approvingly. "That's good. That's the point, right? We fight the war so we can stop fighting, so we can build something better." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.